So when you first start up Blender, again, it's good to make sure that you're using the LTS version, the newest one when you go and download it. And right now that is at 4.52. And it'll give you the option if you're using the older one, if you want to import your older settings, but the settings are pretty straightforward. I like to use the dark theme because it's a little bit easier on the eyes. And for following, if you're kind of new to it, just kind of keep them as is because it'll make, this tutorial and other tutorials a little bit easier to follow. So if you go ahead and save new preferences, and then you have different options here when you're creating a new file, but let's just start off with general for now. And this is kind of the typical how Blender first starts off. It gives you this little box here. And if you're new to Blender or 3D modeling, it could be pretty overwhelming and daunting with all the different windows that's going on here and what's down here and what's over here. Um, and that's okay. We're going to kind of break them down into steps. And when in doubt, it's really helpful just to even just hover over the different areas, and I'll kind of tell you, what's what, and kind of give you your bearings. But again, we're going to break it down and kind of get you started. So you have different menus up here at the top, depending on what you're doing. And the first one that starts you off with is the layout. And this is just kind of a general overview of like, what you can do in it. The thing that it does have down at the bottom that we really won't do much with through, the most part is it has this little animation window down at the bottom in your timeline. But what'll happen too is you have this open. Sometimes you'll hit the space bar and it'll start playing and you're like, wait, that wasn't supposed to happen. So keep that in mind too as you're kind of working. If you kind of notice like some kind of like time or counter thing going on, you might have clicked this down here as well. Um, as you kind of progress more in using Blender, these windows can be changed depending on what you're working on, or they can be kind of customized as you kind of get more comfortable. And we'll do a little bit of that, but for the most part, we're going to keep them pretty basic, pretty solid. Um, and kind of think about what you're doing. That's how we're going to kind of go through and break this down a little bit. Since we're going to first start off with modeling, I'm just going to go over the modeling tab over here because that's going to be kind of most helpful for what we need to do. Now, if you notice over here, there's these different modes as well, and we're going to be going through these different modes depending on what we're doing and what that means. But the most important part in any kind of like big, project you're working on is to make sure that you're saving it. If you know up here, it says unsaved. So make sure that you're always saving your project as you're going, um, and kind of keeping it organized because when you start making these projects more and more complex, you're spending a lot of time on them, you don't want to lose them. And then when your projects are involving stuff like textures and different files are relating, they kind of need to be within the same area. So making sure that you're saving as you're going and that you're all this stuff is kind of organized, contained on your computer somehow. Now, I'm using a PC, I'm using Windows. You can get it for Mac, but some of the settings are a little bit different if you're using Mac, and that's okay as well. I typically won't use a whole lot of hotkeys in the beginning. Hotkeys are like little keyboard shortcuts. It kind of makes your workflow technique speed up. But in the beginning, I'm just going to be kind of doing it things a little bit more slower so you can kind of hopefully understand it a little bit better. So in this scene, this is usually what is within the Blender every time you start a new general one, is you have these three things. You have a light source, you have this cube that they love to drop in there, and then a camera. And the camera is what we'll be rendering images out of, and you can kind of position this around like you would a camera in real life to get different angles, and you can do different adjustments on that as well. Um, and then we have this box. So for moving around in our um, window, which is like our consider our 3D viewport with this giant screen over here, you have different ways of kind of moving around. If you hold down your mouse wheel, it'll allow you to kind of move around the scene in 3D. If you notice up here as well, I have this little gizmo on like it kind of shows me, which way is my Z axis, which is my up and down. This red which is another one of my horizontal axis, and then also have my Y direction. And then you can also click on these if you want to move just dependent on that. The hardest part in the beginning, I think getting used to in 3D modeling software, if you're new to it, is just navigating. It's going to feel kind of confusing and disorienting moving around in 3 dimensions. Again, you don't need like uh, any kind of fancy equipment other than a mouse. I feel like is the most helpful. You can use a trackpad on a laptop, but it can be a little bit more challenging. Um, so you can also use this mouse wheel to zoom in and zoom out. So if you have your mouse wheel on your keyboard, that'll allow you to kind of get closer or away from your object that you want to zoom in on. And then you can hold down Shift on your keyboard. And if you drag your middle mouse wheel, it'll allow you to kind of move around your scene a little bit. So again, you just hold down your middle mouse wheel, allow you to rotate. If you Shift hold down your mouse wheel, that'll allow you to kind of drag around your scene and kind of move around your object. And then if you use your mouse wheel, just kind of scroll and scroll out, it'll allow you to zoom in and zoom out. And those are kind of like the basic ways kind of move around your scene. And there's some other ways we'll look at, um, kind of like zoom to object and different stuff as well as we progress. Now, if you look at this object mode that we're over here, if you take a look at our basic tools, we have different tools that we can kind of look at going down. So if we have our selection box, there's certain ways you can select stuff. Sometimes um, if you're kind of selecting a bunch of objects and you want to kind of avoid certain ones, you can kind of select some of these other ones to kind of fit where you want. So what this does is it allows me to like just select around this object and it'll allow me to highlight it. So I know this is selected. And you can verify that too if you go over here in your outliner, you can kind of see these are, the collection within my scene of the different objects. So I have a camera, I have a cube, and a light, and then I know this is selected. And if I wanted to say select my camera, it'll highlight, and I can also select on here as well. So sometimes that'll help too if you're having trouble selecting something or you forgot where it's at in your scene. You can find it sometimes a little bit easier in your collection. So it's good to kind of make sure again your outliners are organized as well, because then you can find stuff better, like naming stuff that you want to actually name and use, and it makes it easier finding, especially as your kind of projects grow and get more complex. Now, you also have ways of hiding things in your viewport if they're getting distracting. You can either just hide it in your viewport, or if you want to disable it in rendering. Then we'll look a little bit more at rendering here in a second. But if I click on this eyeball, I can hide stuff. And this allows me often if I want to isolate or work on a certain object and kind of focus on it and kind of ignore some of the more complex stuff, I'll highlight the stuff that I only want to work on. Now this cursor is it kind of helps us like as like an anchor point kind of when we're working in our system. So if we have this, if you notice it's right now it's set to the center of our window and it's right on like, right in the middle of our all three axes, which is helpful. And but sometimes you want to move this and we'll kind of take a look at the different steps on why you might want to move it and we'll kind of go from there as we need it. But for the most part, it's just a way to kind of help us line stuff up and allows us to um, kind of make those, yeah, like as an anchor tool. So if you go down, we have this move tool. And if you notice you hover over here, it'll kind of give you different shortcuts or hotkeys as well if you want to end up using those. But again, for the most part in the beginning, I'm going to avoid it to make things a little bit simple. So you have this move tool. And again, this will allow you to kind of move things in along the axes that you need. So if I want to move along my red or my X axis, I can do that. And then I can also move it up and down along my Z. This gives me a lot of control over my object. I can also rotate, and this works pretty similarly as well, where I can, click and drag it and rotate it around my Z axis, um, my Y axis, and you kind of know where it's going. Now, the the helpful thing as well is if you notice if I rotate this, say, it's going to be really hard for me to get it to 90. If you notice up in the upper left corner of the screen, um, I'm pressing Control Z for undo a lot too. You'll notice that as I work my videos, I do like a lot of undo, which is, I guess, I'm kind of lying and saying I'm not using a hotkey because I tend to use the Control Z or Command Z if you're using a Mac to undo a lot. But you'll notice that it'll say what my rotation angle is up in my upper left. So it's saying right now it's 95. So if I'm trying to get this right at 90, that's kind of challenging. But every time you make a movement or a rotation or a scale or something like that, this little window down here pops up and you have an option to just manually type it in. So if I want to rotate that 90 degrees, I could just type that in and then it will set to my 90, which is really helpful when you're trying to have stuff line up and move exactly how you want to. Um, you can also go over here and gives you a little bit more information about, your transforms as well. Like here's my rotation. So if I wanted this to actually be 45 degrees, it'll give me an option to rotate that around too. So again, I'm gonna do Control Z to set things back to 0. Here's my scale. So this will allow me to make things bigger and smaller. So if I click on my object and I click on scale, it changes these things into little boxes. Now I can click and scale this up again on each one of my axes individually. Or if I select on the center, it'll allow me to kind of do it all at the same time. So it'll allow me to make it bigger or smaller evenly, which is helpful. Or I could just manually type that in. If I just want this to be all double, we can make that all the same. Now, you could set the scale of your objects and your units that you're working in. By default, Blender uses meters. So that's something to keep in mind as you're kind of working, scaling stuff out. We're not doing really anything like too mechanical or technical. So I'm not really that concerned about it just yet. But when we're looking at exporting them out to game engines and other software, we'll take a little bit um, more room at that. And then this transform is great because it just kind of incorporates all those tools. So if you have the transform selected, you can move these things around. You could scale it and you can rotate it all in the same tool. So again, Control Z. And then annotate's nice, especially if you're teaching tutorials and stuff. And this will allow me just to write on and take notes on my over my screen, kind of like an overlay, which is not something you need to really worry about just yet. And then measuring is helpful. It'll allow you to measure angles. And then we'll take a look at how to add objects as well. So say like I didn't want to work on a cube. I wanted to, so let's go ahead and just select that and press delete. If you're working on a Mac, I believe it's X to delete. So I can go to up here, I go to add, and we're going to add a mesh. And we'll take a look at, some of these other objects we can add as well as we progress. But let's just add, you have stuff like as a plane, which is just a flat, one-sided, 2 dimensions object. And then let's go ahead and delete that. And then if you add our mesh, our cube again, which is probably the most common, you can go ahead and add another one of these cubes, and you can set the size too. You can also add a circle, which doesn't really have any, faces to it just yet. It's just an outline essentially. And then we can also add two different types of spheres. One's a UV sphere, and you could set how detailed you want. And in the beginning, it's not that much of a concern, but really, I'm a big fan of like less is more. It's easier to work with in the beginning. You can always add, it's easier to make stuff more complex later than it is to reduce. And when it's easier to kind of work with simpler fewer points and faces when you're modeling in the beginning, and then kind of adding more, detail as you need them. And then when you're like working in stuff like, animation projects or games, you really have to start being efficient and thinking about, um, using less, polygons, less points for stuff to render a lot quicker. Because if you have stuff that's like too complex, it could be pretty cumbersome on different game engines or different animation projects, and you can run into trouble. So you've really got to be efficient. And like, again, I feel like it's easier to kind of set up a simpler object at the beginning and then kind of have it become more complex as you need it. Um, so I'm going to go ahead and delete that. If you go to add mesh, there's also the icosphere, and it's based off of triangles. Um, we can kind of talk about the differences between the two. I typically don't use I typically use the UV sphere more so. And another thing to think about too is, and we'll learn more about this as we kind of get more complex, is having stuff um, as many just try to like keep things as your different faces as rectangles as opposed to like triangles, um, or even like a hectagon shape or stuff like that, and kind of have everything match up to like be these 4 points. And it's not stuff that you really have to like think about just yet. But we'll refer to more why and why that's important later on. But just something to kind of keep in mind, again, as you're working. Cylinders, it's pretty similar to if you want to do like less, but then you kind of run into a point of like, okay, this is not really a cylinder anymore. It's a hexagon, and that sort of thing. Or like, well, it'll let me do a cube. It's not really a cylinder anymore. So keep in mind too, if you start adding like less detail, then you actually, you run to that point where it's not helpful and stuff like that. So, um, that's something to think about. And then you also have a cone and a torus. And then this torus is this donut shape, which is a lot of fun too. And then Blender has kind of like their mascot, which is this monkey shape, which is you'll see, used to, it's kind of their trademark shape that they use as well. But we won't really be spending too much time with the monkey shape. So if I go to let's do, yep, we'll do a cube. I feel like that's kind of the easiest thing to kind of think about and use. And if you notice over here, we'll take a look more about some of these things next week. Over here on the right, we'll be looking at, modifiers and more about these object properties and these tools and rendering and, so on and so forth. But in the beginning, we're going to focus on kind of some of these other windows. So keep in mind, you're like, what is this going on over here? We'll take a look more at the properties panel next week. So you have different modes. We have this object mode, which allows us to kind of add objects or separate objects and move stuff around in our scene and kind of placement. So it's kind of like our general layout. And again, if you haven't saved yet and you kind of like already started creating, just get in the habit of saving as you go. Um, Next, we're going to look at our edit mode. And this is what we're going to be kind of focusing on this week, is looking at using our tools in edit, because this will give us plenty to work with. And for the most part, this is where you're going to spend, I think, most of your time at the beginning, when you're modeling stuff, is just going through these basic edit tools. Now, if you notice that you still have your move tools here, but then you have a plethora of other tools as well. And one of the things that adds in our edit um, screen is that we have different things we can select now within our object. So within our object mode, it kind of allows us to we have more than one object in our scene. Say if I had a cylinder in here as well, and I move this out of the way, I can select one of these objects, edit, and this will allow me to work on just this cube. Um, and then I can also select different parts of what makes up this 3D object. And you have kind of work in, I guess, reverse. You have faces that you can select, and you also have lines that you can select. And these are the different components that make up our object. And then you also have points or vertices. So you have some room that you can, if you want to start really moving this shape around, is you can start moving these points around or these faces around to give you a lot more control um, what you want this object to start turning into. Now, you can also start going down these other tools and seeing what they actually do. One of the most, I guess, useful ones I use is this extrude. You can extrude different parts of it. I typically just focus on extruding faces because this allows me to kind of keep everything kind of contained. And if I select that, this will allow me to extrude or kind of push out from one of these faces. And then I can also, keep going with that if I wanted to. I can select, you know, from this face out. If it's not going, if it's kind of getting, see how this is kind of going off in a direction I don't want it to. If I press, like X or Y, I can kind of control the axis this will go on. So it kind of locks this to the Y axis. If I press Y, if I press Z, it'll allow me to go up and down, but that isn't really helpful for that direction. So that's something to think about. It kind of gives you a little more control over it. You can also then kind of hop back over and use the scale and scale this down if you want. And then continue to extrude. And just start building stuff with it. And we'll take a look at, what we should actually build and using reference. But for now, in the beginning, I'm just kind of going through these basic tools. So then we'll look at like doing an inset, which is similar. So you can kind of bring this shape in, and then you can go to move and kind of push this up to kind of create another shape and kind of extrude. Another useful tool is the loop cut. And I do a lot of modeling with just loop cuts and extrude. So a loop cut will allow me to add a loop around different sections of this. So if I wanted just to select and create a loop and cut that, and then I can also just scale this loop bigger or smaller. And start shaping this out into some weird sci-fi teapot or whatever I'm making over here, and kind of start giving more shape. And you notice how we kind of start off with just a cube, right? And this is already starting to look a little bit more rounded um, than it it needs to be for it, than we first started with, I guess. And then Polybuild, we can take a look at Polybuild and Knife later on. Again, Knife is great, but it can be kind of tricky in the beginning where you can start um again breaking this rule of having, less quads. And what I mean by that, so Knife will kind of let me do like almost like a loop cut, but controlled on an area. So I would rather use a loop cut because then you're making sure you're still keeping with these quads or these rectangle shapes or square shapes. You can also use some of these as well, shrink, flatten. Um, Edge slide is similar to loop cut, which is great. Um, if you select this rip, um, regen. And again, I would kind of avoid using that one as well, because you can start running into this problem where you start kind of breaking stuff away from, what this cube type shape. And that's not always, something you need to worry about, but for the most part, um, yeah, I would just kind of maybe stay in the green area in the beginning, or at least for this first week, and we can kind of take a look at exploring some of these other ones later. Maybe even staying again away from like polybuild and knife spin. It's something we can kind of explore a little bit more too later on. Um, and it can be used for different things. So I'll show you spin. Let's use our cylinder here for spin, just to kind of show you a couple different things you can do with spin. So if I go to edit and I go to spin, it's going to allow me to select these different axes that are around my Y or my X. And whatever I have selected, right now I have the whole thing selected. So it's going to spin this around. Um, and I can set up the steps I wanted to take. Say like I only wanted, four of these. So now it's going to add four. And then I can also just make this to, if I want this to go 360 degrees, then this is all set up. Um, auto merge is good to have on because otherwise, if you notice this one here, that kind of you see this fuzziness, it means like there's a duplicate that's going on. And then you can go ahead and have that. And what it's doing, if you notice, is it's spinning it around this cursor. So if I go back, right, and if I move my cursor over here, and then I go to spin, now it's going to spin around that direction. So again, this is where our cursor comes in handy. And you notice that I'm in edit mode. So these are all contained within, consider this one object of my cylinder, right? So if I look over here, um, you can see that it's still just considered one object. So this can be good and bad. It kind of keeps things contained, but sometimes it can make stuff that's harder for you to separate and select it when you want it to. So that's something to keep in mind. So now this is just one object, and I can kind of move this around as one object, which again is helpful. But if I want to move this, these around individually, I have to go to edit and I have to select, um, all these individual faces, right? So if I wanted to select this, I'd actually have to go through and, select all of these um, pieces, and that kind of makes it challenging. So if I go through and select stuff, it just, you kind of want to keep in mind of like what mode you're working on. Like say if I wanted to add um, a mesh to this, um, if I added a cube, again, it would be considered within the same object, and then this would all move together as a group. And again, that's nice. You want stuff to be kind of contained, but then again, it could be more challenging when you kind of have these complex objects, and it makes it harder. So it's one of those things, kind of like with kind of starting off simple. Keep things as separate as you can. Then then you can kind of add them and join them later if you need to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a couple things in these menus up here. So if I have these all selected, but I wanted to separate them, um, I can go to select all. So I'm going to have these selected. And then I'm going to go to mesh. And then I'm going to go down to separate by loose parts. So this will select everything that's not connected to each other. And there's different ways we can kind of take a look at what this actually will do. But now I can go through and separate these out. into different objects. And I can once move them. And if I wanted to combine them, I can select all these. This is an object mode again, because if I would select these in edit mode, I'm only focused on, whatever I select. So I can only, if I wanted to select two, I can edit these within that. But say if I wanted to join these, and I'll do that if I'm like exporting a really complex um, model and I want to, to make it more efficient, you can go to object and you can go down to join. And then these will be, again, one connected um, group again. So I'm going to go back and then we'll look at spin for one more thing that I'll use it for other than this like radial type thing. And that's like for creating tubes. And there's more efficient ways of creating tubes. That's something I'll kind of learn through modeling is there's going to be different ways to do things. There's going to be different workflows. Um, and you'll kind of learn your own like preferences, like if you use loop cuts more, if you use extrudes more, and that's okay. So if we go to our spin, and then I'm going to move that here. So let's go back to spin. And you notice this time I have it just selected over this face. And then I'm going to rotate it that way. So now I can kind of control this a little bit and kind of move that, increase my steps to kind of create like some like tube type shapes. And sometimes it can be tricky trying to get, where you want your cursor to line up. But that'll kind of just kind of take some finagling and kind of moving stuff around. But then you can start creating some tube type structures as you go. So I'm like, well, let's make the steps a little bit more to give it a little bit smoother, but somewhere between some being, again, being efficient, and kind of going from there. And then I'm going to scale this down to this direction so it's flat. And you notice over here, it's not quite flat, so I'll make this 0. So this is now aligned with my Z axis. So it's zeroed out. And now I can extrude it and create some kind of pipe type structure. And I'll use it sometimes to create pipes. There's other ways you can kind of go through and create it. That's just one way. So let's go back to object mode and look at a couple more things we can kind of look at. If you notice here, I have this like little origin point. And like when it's not centered on my object anymore. And that's because when I created this was created during the spin. And it's kind of created this as my center point for all these objects. And sometimes you want to move this around. I'll look at why you might want to move this around next week. But for now, we're going to look at setting this back. So if I go to object, I go to set origin, I'm going to go to origin to geometry. And you can also set this at cursor, which I'll do often too, depending on what I want. So I'll go to origin to geometry, and it'll set it back here. So now this is at the center, and it just makes it a little bit more, makes more sense when you're moving stuff around. So you can also set your origin or your cursor. I swear I was going to do hotkeys, but if you do Shift S, it'll bring up where you can set your cursor at. So again, that's Shift S. Then you go to cursor to world origin if you want to reset that to that. So that's Shift S to bring up this. And again, I'll try not to use too many of these hotkeys because they can get complex. But there's different sheets out there that maybe I can even share on here with like some general hotkeys. And then if you're like looking at this cylinder, it's like, well, I don't want to see all these faces on here. I want this to be smooth. And that starts looking at how this is being like visualized or rendered or shaded. So if you go to object, and again, there's so much on here, so we're going to focus on just a few of these things. But if you go to object, you have different options. You can shade flat, which is what it's currently set at. Auto smooth is an interesting one too, but if you go to shade smooth, it shades this whole shape um, as a smooth object. Now, this is again a great way to keep things efficient, low poly without having to make it really complex or adding a lot of, ge like unnecessary geometry to it. But one thing you'll notice is that you kind of still see the edges in the silhouette. So if you're kind of looking at stuff that, up close, you'll notice that like, you can still see where this edge is, um, depending on the silhouette. And then the one that you can kind of play around and see which one you like better is this auto smooth. Um, Sometimes looks a little bit nicer. But then again, too, you kind of like have to think about, what's the best of both worlds as well. Um, One last tool that we didn't really look at is this bevel. And bevel is something that it it's great, but it's something you might want to save till the end, um, because it could start making it harder to do stuff like loop cuts and some of your other tools, and it'll often add geometry um, really quickly. So I tend to use like bevel as kind of like the last tool I'll use when I'm kind of smoothing stuff up. So what I'll do is if I want to select, say, this whole, instead of going through and holding down shift and like trying to select this whole face up here, all these lines up here, it can be challenging. You can also just select the face, which is one way of doing it. If I want to select these lines, um, if you hold down the Alt on your keyboard, I think it's the option on a Mac, um, and select, it'll allow you to select an edge loop. So if I were to put in an edge loop here or a loop cut here, then I could say like if I wanted to select, this one down here, if I hold Alt select, it'll allow me to select that. And it's dependent on where you click on it too. Sometimes if your geometry is really complex, it'll be hard. And you can do the same thing with faces with that as well. So you can select that around. So why that's important for a bevel is I had this selected. You can do it with the face as well. And you can do a bevel, which will kind of round out our corners a little bit. And then again, this pops up and it shows you have a little more control over it. Like how this actually does it is a percentage. Is it, um, offset? How many segments do you want it to be? So if you want it to look a little bit more round, a little bit more detail, a little more geometry, if the object's bigger and it's gonna, it kind of needs the extra um, geometry and you really want it to be smooth, then that's great as well. Then you can do the size. Now, adding bevels to your objects is going to make them look a lot better. I mean, there's nothing. One rule we'll kind of talk about, I guess not really rule, but something that to think about when you're creating objects, especially using computers, is that everything's going to look really perfect in the beginning because you're using a computer to create it. These are perfect shapes, but stuff created, in our world, in our natural environment, is not perfect. Like even a table, if you notice the edge, it has like an ever so slight bevel to it. Even a knife isn't perfectly like sharp, even at like a nanoscale. So even like every little edge in our reality is going to have a little bit of a bevel to it. That's again something why I saved till the very end um, to kind of start adding that little bit of extra like imperfection. And I think that these thinking about how things are kind of handmade or made in stuff with like gravity and everything's going to be kind of imperfect. So a lot of 3D modelers um, they'll build stuff out and they'll go through and they'll make these tweaks to make it more imperfect. And we'll kind of talk more about this and show. I'll share some examples, but you'll see a lot more in like architecture and stuff like that. But you'll kind of like maybe moving some points out and kind of moving stuff out of the way to kind of make it look a little bit give it more personality, and make it look more natural will kind of actually make it more believable. And this is the fact that, is usually referred to like robotics and animatronics, I guess, and like more humanoid type stuff, but it's like uncanny valley. So stuff that starts looking too um, mechanical or perfect. Like we kind of had this like weird response to it where it becomes less believable and acceptable than stuff that's a little bit, more, I guess, bent and misshapen. So when you have these like little selection things as well, or if I want to select these vertices and kind of, instead of moving these individually or shift selecting and moving them around, I could highlight this up here, this proportional editing, and this will allow me to move stuff around. Um, Depending on, like how close it is to that. And if I'm moving this around, you notice there's this circle all around everything. That's how big the proportion is going to be. So if I use my mouse wheel, I can make that tighter or bigger, and it can kind of give me a little bit more control over, again, kind of like having this stuff. I really want to make this look a little bit more warped. And when you're looking at models and stuff like that, you're watching a, 3D animated film, really pay attention to that. Like how much people and animators are really, or 3D modelers and designers are really bending stuff to make them perfectly look imperfect, to make them more interesting or more believable and give them more personality. And really, that's what this first assignment is going to focus on, is going through and making stuff, have a personality, out of just, really basic objects. So again, these are some like really basic tools, but you can do a lot. This is what, most of like the 3D modeling you're going to spend your time using is within, edit mode, and then using, object mode to maybe move stuff around. Don't touch sculpt mode yet. We're going to be looking more at sculpting when we're looking at characters. But really, in the beginning, I feel like learning more about the editing and the what's considered like hard surface, really, I think lays the foundation for more of like the sculpted and softer stuff, and it allows us to understand geometry a lot better. So the last thing we want to look at is rendering out our scenes and our images. And we're not going to get, we'll look a little bit more deeply at lighting and really how to make stuff look more like a camera setup. But for now, we just want to look at the basic of it. So if you go to render, you go to render image. It's going to take a while, but it'll go ahead and render out your. And it'll kind of give us an image that we can then just share as a 2D image. And it just kind of uses that light source that we have. Then you can go to image. You could save this, somewhere as a JPEG or a PNG, and then share that. And that's what you're going to be using to kind of like show your work off, post on your portfolio. And again, we're going to look more at lighting and texturing. But you can also move this camera around to get different angles. Another way of doing that and moving that camera around is if you kind of use your viewport. You can also set, if you go to view and you go to align active camera to view, is another way of doing it. You can also render, and then it'll kind of show you what you're going to render ahead of time. And then this will allow you to kind of get a couple different angles to make it more interesting. You can also play around with this light if you want and kind of move that around. But again, we're going to look more at really how to make something look, when we start looking at materials and textures, a little bit more believable, and really you do a lot with texturing with really simple geometry. But for now, just focus on the basics. So save your scene, and then we'll take a look at actually building some stuff out and kind of that workflow that I would use for that.